Today I'm going to talk about something called intersectionality. A lot of people probably haven't heard the term, but once I start talking about this, I think you'll understand why it's an important term and how much of an effect it's having on our society right now. So let me draw this as an example. The idea is that we all have different experiences, and depending on our degree of marginality, sometimes those experiences come together in a way that make us even more marginalized than we would based on something like race or income or gender or sexuality. So all of these different things come together and meet and define how oppressed we are. Basically, the idea is that the more marginalized you are, the higher you rank in the oppression hierarchy. And the more you are allowed to speak, and the more people are supposed to defend you and help carry your load because you've been oppressed. So it's all based on the concept that the more oppressed you are, the more society owes you. There are a lot of things wrong with the idea of intersectionality, but one of the biggest concerns that I have is that intersectionality forces people to reveal things about themselves that they may not want to reveal. It forces you to expose your inner identity, because it's only through exposing these ways in which we've been oppressed that we are allowed to claim our entitlement to having allies and to being oppressed. So I have this backpack here, and typically people have either lighter loads or heavier loads. Some of us have heavier loads because we've had more experiences that haven't been particularly fun. Some people have very light loads because they've had a really blessed life, and good for them. So the idea behind intersectionality is that we all have these bags, these backpacks, this baggage that we carry through no fault of our own, and that's important. We need to make sure that we emphasize through no fault of our own. Some of us are more oppressed than others. And here's the thing, and I'm doing this because I feel like this is an important thing to talk about, but most people don't want to share the ways in which they've been oppressed because it's revealing very intimate details about themselves. The other thing is those of us who've had traumatic experiences, tough lives, difficulties, whatever you want to call it, a lot of us have gone through therapy to mitigate the impact of these things. And what therapy does is it teaches us to lighten our loads, to integrate what has happened to us, to move on, to tell ourselves a better story, basically. The problem with intersectionality is it's saying, no. Don't work on it. Don't try and make your life better. You need to acknowledge how oppressed you have been because of your experiences. For example, I have a bag full of bricks here to represent my experiences. I have one here marked gender dysphoria because as a child I had gender dysphoria. And up until recently, almost no one knew that I had this other than the teachers I had when I was a child and the therapist I saw when I was a child and my mother, I think. Maybe my father knew. I know my mom sent her a letter about it, but basically the circle of people who knew that I experienced gender dysphoria was very, very small until recently. And I started sharing my gender dysphoria because I'm not allowed to talk about gender dysphoria unless I can say I have personal experience with it. So this brick that used to be very light has become heavier and heavier and heavier as I've had to talk about my gender dysphoria in order to be allowed to talk about issues relating to puberty blockers being used on children and medically transitioning young people. All right, another brick. And this is a heavy brick because I'm still working on it. But it's actually a lot lighter than it used to be. It used to be cripplingly heavy. And this is the childhood sexual assault I endured. And it's still pretty heavy and hard to talk about, but it's one of the bricks that I carry, and it's a lot lighter than it used to be. But if I want to get any points for my childhood sexual abuse, I have to not only talk about it, but I have to talk about how badly it impacted me. So all my life I've worked with therapists to talk about how I can recover from this sexual assault that happened. And now I'm having to dredge it back up as the Me Too movement is talking about sexual assaults all the time. Let's see. Oh, I've got this other brick. Most people are not able to see this brick because it's hidden in my bag most of the time where I want it to be because I don't like talking about my problems. But these are my physical disabilities. I have physical disabilities that drastically limit my ability to function the way normal people do, the way physically able people do. And I prefer not to talk about it because one of the things that I've learned about pain and pain management is that the less you focus on your pain, the easier it is to have a normal daily life. So if I have to talk about my physical disability all the time, I'm actually undoing exactly what I need to do to function better. So this brick gets heavier in my bag. Let's see, I've got this other brick, and this is my mental illness, which nobody should have to talk about. But in order to have credibility within intersectionality, I have to talk about my mental health issues. I have to talk about the fact that I've been diagnosed with OCD and PTSD, major depressive disorder, an eating disorder, an anxiety disorder, and actually other mental illnesses that up until now I haven't wanted to share, I haven't wanted to talk about, I've wanted to manage. But because of intersectionality, I have to pull this brick out and talk about it and tell people, oh, I have the right to talk about mental illness because I've been diagnosed. And there's some things in this bag that I'm still not willing to share that would raise my credibility in the intersectionality movement, in the oppression Olympics, but they're private. They're so private. They're even more private than the fact that I was sexually assaulted as a child. They're even more private than the fact that I have these mental health issues. They're even more private than the fact that I had gender dysphoria. These are private things that I want to keep private. And intersectionality is saying, no, no, no. In order to be part of the oppression Olympics and to determine where you are on the hierarchy of oppression versus privilege, you have to show your cards. You have to show us where you stand. Some of them are physical. For example, some would say that I'm thin. Therefore, I have thin privilege. Even though I have severe eating disorders and body dysmorphia that make being thin not privilege. I have to talk about those in order to say, oh, no, I don't have that type of privilege. I actually have this type of oppression. These are really, really personal things. These are identity issues. And even though people who are talking about all these gender identity issues feel comfortable flaunting their identity to the world, a lot of us would rather not. A lot of us find our identity to be very private, and we want to guard it and cherish it and manage it so that we can be healthy and functional. We don't want to constantly be talking about how heavy our load is. And I know this sounds crazy. Why am I talking about all these things? Because I didn't talk about the most important thing of all. If I don't have oppression, it means I have privilege. And people who have privilege, first of all, are not allowed to talk about these issues. They're not allowed to inform these issues with their stories. So in order to be eligible to have a voice in these discussions, you have to show that you're oppressed rather than privileged. The more privileged you are, the more you are responsible to pick up this heavy bag of bricks that I'm carrying and carry it for yourself. And if you don't, you are an oppressor. So basically, everybody who isn't oppressed or an ally of the oppressed is an oppressor. And that means you're transphobic, homophobic, you're a bigot, you're a misogynist, you are bad. So you either have to have oppression or be an ally. And an ally, by the way, is someone who silently carries the bag of people like me who have oppression and who don't talk about it and who don't question. So if I say, I want my bag over there, if you're my ally, you better put my bag over there without questioning it, because I'm the one that's oppressed. And the only reason that you are not an oppressor is because you are my ally and you're doing exactly what I tell you to do. You're behaving the way I say you have to behave in order to not be an oppressor. And basically, what I'm being told is I have to wear my abusive relationship. I have to wear my poverty. I have to wear my learning disability. I have to wear my mental illness. And I have to wear my physical disabilities and my gender dysphoria. I'll put that one right on my breast. And best of all, my childhood sexual assault. I have to wear all these and make them public in order for me to show that I am not an oppressor, that I'm actually oppressed. And by the way, these aren't all the labels. There are some that even now, even though I'm sharing all this incredibly personal stuff, there are labels that I'm not willing to share because I feel like they are intensely private. And I'm willing to be labeled an oppressor in order to keep some of those things private. But I shouldn't have to, and none of us should have to. None of us should have to wear labels like this in order to prove that we are not the oppressors, to prove that we're not homophobes, transphobes, bigots, racists, Nazis, evil, bad people. So, this is very personal. It's hard to talk about, and it makes me very angry that I have had to reveal all this in order to have a place at the table to talk about my lived experience. And I want to tell you what else happens, because this is the most insidious thing of all. So we've got this idea of privilege and oppression, and you have to prove you're oppressed in order to show that you don't have privilege. And what happens is that if you don't agree with the current narrative, you've internalized your privilege. Therefore, even though I'm wearing all these labels, if I don't agree with the current narrative of oppression, I've actually internalized my oppression. And therefore, all these experiences don't matter anymore, because I don't agree with the whole concept of people having privilege and people having oppression, and those who have the most oppression being able to run the narrative, to push the narrative. The other thing that happens is that people say, it's not that bad. If you overcame your gender dysphoria, if you learned to manage your gender dysphoria, it must not have been that bad. And that's why you don't agree with us, because your gender dysphoria was not that bad. Or your sexual assault was not that bad, because if it was, you would still be traumatized from it. You would still be debilitated by it. So they say, if you don't agree with us, your experiences were not that bad, and therefore, you're part of the oppressive group. They will also say, you're crazy. If you don't agree with us, you're clearly crazy. And so this is called gaslighting, and they're saying that all these experiences, which actually, yes, have made me crazy, because they're pretty awful experiences, but they're saying because I don't agree with them, I'm crazy. Not because of all these experiences, but because I don't agree with them, I'm crazy. Or as I said, that I've internalized my oppression. So I've actually become the very thing that oppressed me. So this is all a way to minimize, to silence, and to disregard anybody who disagrees with the current narrative. So, let me kind of summarize this a little bit. In order for me to say I don't want to be called a cis woman, I have to talk about my gender dysphoria. In order for me to want to talk about issues of abuse, I have to talk about my abuse. In order to have a voice about let's see, domestic abuse. I wasn't married, but when I was in college, I was in a very abusive relationship. But I have to talk about that, and I'd rather not. So in the oppression Olympics, I do pretty well. I could, in theory, have a very high rank in this oppression Olympics, but I don't want to participate. And I don't want to have to participate. I don't want to have to prove that I was oppressed and that I am not an oppressor.